For millions of fans, the Beatles represent the greatest success story in music history. Their songs changed popular culture, inspired generations of artists, and transformed four young musicians from Liverpool into global icons. Yet behind the extraordinary achievements was a relationship that evolved through friendship, admiration, creative competition, and, eventually, growing tension. Among the most fascinating stories within the band is the bond between Paul McCartney and George Harrison, a friendship that began in childhood, survived unimaginable fame, and later faced challenges neither of them could have predicted. Long before the Beatles became a worldwide phenomenon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were simply two boys growing up in Liverpool with a shared love of music. They first became acquainted while attending the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys during the mid-1950s. Paul was slightly older than George and had already earned a reputation as an intelligent student with remarkable musical ability. George, meanwhile, was quieter and less enthusiastic about school itself. Years later, Harrison openly admitted that he disliked his time at the Institute, often feeling disconnected from the strict academic environment. However, the daily bus rides to and from school gave the two teenagers an opportunity to discover something far more important than classroom lessons: their mutual passion for music. Those conversations quickly shifted from school life to guitars, songs, and the exciting musical trends sweeping across Britain. During the rise of the skiffle movement, countless young people realized they could form bands using simple instruments and determination rather than expensive equipment. Paul and George admired many of the same American rock and roll pioneers, including Elvis Presley, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly. Harrison was especially inspired after hearing Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel, an experience that deepened his desire to become a guitarist. He devoted countless hours to practicing chords and studying guitars, while Paul benefited from growing up in a musical household. His father, Jim McCartney, had performed in a jazz band years earlier, encouraging Paul's interest in piano before he eventually mastered the guitar. Although there was a 1-year age difference between them, music erased any sense of separation and brought them together as equals. George's determination became increasingly obvious as he formed his own skiffle group, the Rebels, alongside his brother Peter and a friend. At nearly the same time, Paul had joined John Lennon's growing band, the Quarrymen. When the group needed another guitarist, Paul immediately believed George was the perfect choice. John Lennon initially hesitated, believing George looked too young to join the band. That opinion changed after George performed an impressive version of Bill Justice's instrumental Raunchy during an informal audition on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus. His technical skill left little room for argument, and he was welcomed into the group. That decision brought together Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison, the musical partnership that would eventually evolve into the Beatles. As teenagers, the three musicians spent endless hours practicing together, teaching each other new techniques, experimenting with song ideas, and imagining lives beyond Liverpool. For Paul, who had tragically lost his mother at a young age, the friendships within the band provided emotional support and a renewed sense of purpose. For George, joining older musicians gave him confidence that he truly belonged in a serious musical group. During these early years, Paul naturally became someone George admired and learned from. Their relationship was built on trust, encouragement, and shared ambition, laying the foundation for one of popular music's most significant creative partnerships. Everything changed once Beatlemania exploded across the world in the early 1960s. Success arrived on a scale few artists had ever experienced, bringing constant touring, recording schedules, and enormous public expectations. Inside the studio, Paul increasingly emerged as one of the band's strongest creative leaders. He constantly searched for new musical ideas, carefully shaped arrangements, and pushed the group toward higher artistic standards. While many admired his dedication, George gradually felt that his own creative voice received less attention. As the Beatles became more ambitious, maintaining equality within the group became increasingly difficult. These differences became especially noticeable during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. The groundbreaking album reflected many of Paul's artistic ideas and helped redefine modern rock music. George contributed the song Within You Without You, inspired by Indian classical music and his growing interest in Eastern philosophy. Although the track became one of the album's most distinctive moments, it stood apart stylistically from the rest of the record. Harrison viewed it as a deeply personal expression of his spiritual journey, while the band's overall focus remained centered on the broader concept of the album. Their different priorities were becoming harder to ignore. The gap widened further during the Beatles' visit to India in 1968. George embraced meditation and spiritual study with genuine commitment, believing those experiences offered a meaningful direction for his life. Paul appreciated the trip, but remained more focused on songwriting and the band's future. While the two respected one another, they increasingly viewed success and personal fulfillment through different lenses. George became frustrated that business concerns and commercial pressures often overshadowed the deeper values he was trying to pursue, while Paul remained determined to keep the Beatles creatively productive. At the same time, Harrison was developing rapidly as a songwriter. For years, most Beatles albums had been dominated by the Lennon-McCartney partnership, leaving relatively little space for George's compositions. Yet by the late 1960s, he had written an impressive collection of songs that demonstrated his growing confidence as both a lyricist and composer. Despite this progress, many of his strongest works struggled to find room on Beatles records. The imbalance became an increasing source of disappointment and added to the creative tension developing inside the band. By early 1969, those tensions reached a breaking point during the filming and recording of the Let It Be project. Cameras captured uncomfortable moments as disagreements surfaced during rehearsals. One of the most memorable exchanges occurred when George responded to Paul's detailed musical instructions by calmly saying he would play whatever Paul wanted, or nothing at all if that was preferred. His words revealed years of frustration rather than a single disagreement. Harrison wanted greater freedom to contribute creatively, while Paul's leadership style, though often intended to improve performances, was increasingly viewed as controlling by some of his bandmates. Behind the scenes, George had already written remarkable songs such as All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. Many of these compositions were not fully developed within the Beatles because recording space remained limited and the Lennon-McCartney partnership continued to dominate album track lists. Harrison believed his work had reached the same artistic level as the others, and he wanted that growth to be recognized. On January 10, 1969, the pressure finally became too much. George Harrison walked out of the Beatles' rehearsals, later explaining that remaining in the situation had become emotionally unhealthy for him. His departure shocked the rest of the group, who quickly realized how important he was, not only as an exceptional guitarist, but also as a vital part of the band's identity. After several meetings and discussions, Harrison agreed to return less than 2 weeks later. Although the Beatles continued working together, the underlying problems had not disappeared. The emotions surrounding that difficult period found their way into George's songwriting. Wah Wah, written shortly after his temporary departure, reflected the stress and frustration he experienced during those sessions. Around the same period, Paul privately acknowledged that George's songwriting had reached an exceptionally high standard, recognizing that Harrison's work deserved far greater appreciation than it had previously received. George, however, believed he had possessed that ability for years and simply needed the opportunity to demonstrate it. By the end of a decade, the friendship that had once been built on shared dreams aboard Liverpool buses had been transformed by fame, artistic ambition, and changing personal priorities. Although disagreements became unavoidable, the respect between Paul McCartney and George Harrison never completely disappeared. Their story remains one of friendship tested by extraordinary success, a reminder that even the closest relationships can be challenged when talent, ambition, and history collide. Understood. I'll rewrite this as a completely original YouTube documentary script while preserving the historical flow and avoiding copied phrasing. I will also avoid presenting disputed claims as facts. Here's the rewritten section. George Harrison's growing frustration during the Beatles' final years eventually found its way into his songwriting. When he released his acclaimed 1970 solo album All Things Must Pass, one song, run-of-the-mill, was widely interpreted as reflecting the emotional strain that had developed between him and Paul McCartney. Lyrics expressing the pain of a damaged friendship led many listeners to believe George was looking back on relationships that had been deeply affected by the band's turbulent final chapter. Although Paul and George would always share an extraordinary history, the emotional wounds left behind by 1969 never completely disappeared. Ironically, the same year that brought the Beatles closer to breaking apart also gave George Harrison the recognition he had waited years to receive. During the recording of Abbey Road, he contributed two unforgettable masterpieces, Here Comes the Sun and Something. These songs proved that George had become one of the group's finest songwriters. Something earned extraordinary praise from fellow musicians, with Frank Sinatra famously calling it one of the greatest love songs ever written, while John Lennon also spoke highly of the composition. After years of standing in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney, George had finally established himself as an equal creative force. Even with that success, the personal relationship between George and Paul remained strained. George often felt that Paul interfered too much in his musical ideas and arrangements, while Paul believed he was simply trying to maintain the band's exceptionally high standards. Their conversations lacked the warmth they once shared, and much of their communication happened through the music itself rather than personal connection. By the time Abbey Road reached audiences in September 1969, the Beatles were already moving toward an inevitable ending. When the breakup became official in 1970, both musicians threw themselves into new beginnings. George surprised the music world with the ambitious triple album All Things Must Pass, a record praised for its emotional depth and artistic maturity. Paul, meanwhile, launched his solo career with McCartney before later finding enormous success with Wings. Although each followed a different musical path, both demonstrated that they could build remarkable careers beyond the Beatles. Yet beneath those achievements, traces of rivalry still lingered. Throughout much of the 1970s, contact between the two was infrequent and sometimes uncomfortable. George openly admitted in interviews that he often found Paul too controlling, even remarking that he could imagine playing in a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. McCartney rarely responded publicly, choosing instead to remain diplomatic. But those comments reportedly affected him more deeply than he admitted. Despite the tension, opportunities for reconciliation occasionally appeared. One such moment came in 1971 when George organized the historic concert for Bangladesh. He invited Paul to participate, but Paul declined because of practical and logistical concerns surrounding the event. Although the decision was not intended as a personal rejection, it added more distance to an already fragile relationship. As the years passed, their lives moved in different directions. George devoted increasing attention to spirituality, family life, and carefully chosen musical projects, while Paul continued recording, touring, and building one of the most successful solo careers in popular music. Even so, the bond created during their years in the Beatles never truly disappeared. Shared memories, triumphs, and disappointments continued to connect them in ways neither could fully escape. By the early 1990s, time had eased some of the bitterness. In February 1994, Paul McCartney